Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's webinar on IT Security Update, Your Patients, Practice and Privacy Protected. We thank you for joining us for this valuable session, and we hope you take away some tips and quick wins to support you, your practice and staff to identify cyber risks and develop security goals to keep you protected. My name is Angela Heathcote and I'm from Eastern Melbourne Primary Health Network. Together with my colleague Julie Allardyce, we welcome our guest speaker, Darcy Inglis from Honest Alley Consulting, and we look forward to Darcy sharing his practical advice on this topic with us. Eastern Melbourne Primary Health Network is primarily funded by the Australian Government to improve the care and support people receive from health services. We aim to improve the health of our community, which includes using technology to make the broader health system work more efficiently. Before we begin tonight, I would like to start this evening by acknowledging the traditional custodians on whose unceded lands that we are gathering on this evening, and from all areas that you may be dialing in from. Tonight, I'm dialing in from the lands of the Wurundjeri people, a very short walk to the Mullumbimby Creek, where each day I'm reminded of the beauty of this area at my doorstep, from the peaceful walk along the bushland that runs the entire length of the waterway to the listening of the local bird life, such as the beautiful black cockatoo. We also acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. Before we begin, just to let you know that all attendees are on mute, Darcy has a very interactive and engaging session tonight, and we'll call out for contributions throughout this webinar. Please add your comments or questions to the chat box or Q&A, and we'll facilitate this with Darcy. Tonight's webinar is being recorded, and all attendees will receive an email with a copy of this recording, the presentation and any relevant resources. At the end of tonight's webinar, you'll also receive a short survey, and we'll be very grateful if you could please take a few minutes just to answer these questions. So without any further delay, I would like to welcome and hand over to Darcy to begin our session. Darcy.
Thank you. Well, thank you very, very much for having me. My name is Darcy. I'm from Honest Ally Consulting, based out of Hobart. I'm a medical practice manager by trade, and I'm very, very excited and appreciative for Eastern Melbourne PHN hosting me here today, and it's a privilege to be with you this evening. I hope you're all settled at home with a glass of wine or relaxing for this midweek session. So today, my job is to talk to you about cybersecurity in practice. And I wanted to take you through the logic of the session. And my thoughts were that given that you've all signed up to attend this session or you're watching on the recording online, I've assumed that you're aware of some of the main cyber risks and the importance that we place in practice on mitigating strategies. And so instead of focusing on a lot of the legality and the standards and the sort of theory, I was hoping to do something a little bit more practical and give you some more hands-on and practical tips to take back to your practice, so that you've got a checklist for tomorrow, a checklist for the medium term, and a checklist for the long term. That being said, I am here today as your servant. So if there is anything that you would like to ask, please do jump into the chat at any time. I'm more than happy to answer questions and spend more or less time in different areas, depending on what you need from me. So I'm here for you. Please don't hesitate to speak up, so to speak, in the chat. That being said, there is an opportunity for interaction here today, so I wanted to go through some housekeeping items before we begin. I am going to run a scenario about halfway through the session, so please don't be afraid. It is optional, but I really, really encourage your participation throughout this presentation, because it's the real world experiences and the, oh, what about this, what about that, and this happened at my practice the other day, that will make the session more interesting. Otherwise, I am more than happy to speak for the full hour, but it's probably, you probably get sick of hearing my voice. So certainly if you'd like to jump in, please do so. If you do have a question that's sort of hyper specific or quite complicated, we may need to take it offline just in the interest of time. And so I will be available to follow up with anybody after the session, or if you're watching on the recording throughout the year. If you have questions, you're welcome to reach out to me at any time, and I'll more than happily assist you with those. That being said, I want you all to sit back and relax. There is a special website. You don't need to go there, but if you want to go there, you're more than welcome. I've given a QR code that should be visible on your screen right now. There is also a link, which is emphn.honestally.com.au. Now, that will take you to a mini website, which is just for you, just specifically for this session. And that website is going to remain available for about the next year or so. So approximately 12 months, this website will remain available. And it has got all the slides for you. You'll notice we have what's called a cybersecurity and privacy roadmap, which is designed to give you all the tips and tricks we're going to be discussing today in this webinar without the need for you having to take notes. If you do feel the need to take notes and that's your process, I understand. There is a link there called the Eastern Melbourne PHN session notes. And what that is it's a document that is a live Google document. So if you click on that link, it will take you to what looks like a Word document where you can make notes and make comments or document some tips about your sessions, about this session. Note that that is public, so everybody on the session will be able to see that. And my team here in Hobart will be moderating those notes and we'll tidy them up. And so that way you'll have a resource to take away with you. But don't feel that you have to take notes. We have given you that roadmap so that you don't need to do that. The last two things are basically extra resources for the session. So we've got, we're going to be doing a mock data breach today, and there is a register there of lessons learned, which I've called the data breach postmortem. And there is also an IT and cybersecurity audit tool for you to take back to your practices. So we've tried to give you not just the webinar, but a full center full of resources there so that you can sit back, relax, and enjoy the session. Not worry too much about making any notes or anything, and those resources will be there for you for the rest of the year, as I understand it. So thank you to Eastern Melbourne PHN for facilitating that. Yeah, that does. So I've got a question come through, a comment come through. Does the vacuuming man have any extra capacity? Look, I'll have to check, but I'm available. Look, as a consultant, I go and do whatever needs to be done. I was in a clinic in Hobart here the other week on a job and ended up changing the batteries in a doctor's door, which I did not think I'd be doing that day. But you know what it's like as a practice manager. You just do what needs to be done. So yes, vacuuming can be on the side. There is also question time at the end, but as I said, jump in at any time. Their session is also being recorded, so just keep that in mind when you're making your comments as well. So without any further ado, I would suggest that we get started. Thanks all for joining me. So we're here to talk about cybercrime, and I thought I'd do some foundational work with you before we get into the practical examples, because we probably have varying levels of cyber awareness in the audience here tonight. And I'm here to say that unfortunately, cybercrime is now the world's most profitable illegal enterprise on the planet. And I think that over the last few years, there's been a real common misconception that you need to be high profile or large in size to be a target. You know, I think it's easy to be in practice and think, oh, well, how would they even know about me? We're just a small practice on the Gold Coast or wherever we might be. You know, how would they even know where to look? And unfortunately, they actually have software that is constantly scanning the internet and pinging different networks and ports, looking for easy targets. And so they're actually not, it's not a human being targeting you or picking you off Google or anything like that. It can be, but my experience is that it's pretty much completely random, totally automated, and these are almost robotic systems that are just scouring the internet, scouring the internet looking for easy targets, essentially. And us as small businesses, and especially with general practices who have tried to make it through the pandemic, a lot of things have slipped to the back burner. We have a lot more limited resources than what we had before in terms of time and probably cash as well. And so we are a great target for cyber criminals because we're weak at the moment due to the pandemic generally, and we have some of the most valuable data on the planet. So to give you an idea, if you think about this, if your credit card was stolen and that is available for sale, your credit card details online for about $2.50, it's not very much. And the reason is that of course, you lose your card, the first thing you do is ring up your bank or go into your app and you change your card. Easy. But the real risk with medical information, it's not just about embarrassing the patients or threatening their privacy, which is a factor as well. I don't want to downplay that. But the real risk for us is identity theft. If someone obtains even one of your records, it's got the date of birth, the middle name, the Medicare card reference number, all sorts of really valuable information that is just this perfect little neat package of an identity just waiting to be stolen. And they are worth up to $1,000 each on the black market, because it's really hard. You can ring up your bank and change your credit card number, but imagine trying to change. I mean, you could move house if you really wanted to change your address, but imagine trying to change your date of birth or changing your name. I mean, it's quite extreme. But if you do have an incident of identity theft, it's really hard to shake. And that's why they're worth up to $1,000 each. So I want you to think about how many patients you have in your database. A lot of practices that I've met in the last year might have 30,000 patients in the database or 10,000 patients. $1,000 times the number of people in your database, and that is essentially the target that's painted on your back. Yeah, that's what we're here today to talk about. In terms of identity theft, I wanted to introduce, this is just a sort of a cute side story, but this lady's name is Kirsten Parr. Now, in a slightly unbelievable story, poor Kirsten was arrested in 2019 for a series of car theft and financial fraud transactions that the authorities believed to be her. And so a warrant was issued for her arrest on Thursday. Unfortunately for her, Friday was a public holiday, Saturday, Sunday was the weekend, Monday was a public holiday. And so this poor lady spent 4 days in state waiting in remand, waiting for her court case, where it was found that her identity was just stolen. I'm not sure if it was from her healthcare provider. I think it was, but don't quote me on that one. Yeah, she was found to be a victim of identity theft, but unfortunately not without spending time behind bars. And it's a classic case of course, only in America does this happen. But I just threw that in there as an example of the sorts of things that can come from having your identity stolen. So here in Australia, it's all governed by the OAIC, which is the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner, who currently is Angeline Falk. And they've identified a whole number of things that can happen, from identity theft, including financial fraud, family violence, physical harm, intimidation. And whilst I'm sure many of you are aware of these risks, what's important to remember is that in general practice, or in healthcare generally, we are one of the last lines of defense pretty much between normal life and some of these issues happening to our patients. And so while we're there to look after their health, it's important that we also look after their safety from all of these other issues as well. Not to mention, of course, the negative impact on your practice's brand and reputation and commercial interests and all those sorts of things as well. So I won't spend too much time on this, because I'm hoping that most of you will be aware of this, but I'm just going to touch on it in case we have any newcomers or anyone. Might be a good time for a refresher. But the national framework for privacy in this country is the Australian Privacy Principles. There's 13 of them. And I really like them because in healthcare, we come across all sorts of weird and wonderful situations. It's definitely not possible for me or the government or anybody else to come along and kind of tell you what to do in any given scenario. So by being familiar with these principles and using them as a framework to kind of guide behavior, decision-making, policies and procedures, I think it's a really good place to start, and I really commend them for putting so much time and effort putting these together. As I said, I'm not going to go through them. If you aren't aware of these, or you would like clarity on any of them, you're welcome to contact me or my office at any time, and I'm happy to go through them at no charge. And I've included a QR code and a link there for you to have a look in your own time if that's something that interests you. In addition to the privacy principles, in 2018 they introduced what's called the mandatory data breach notification scheme, rather. So I'm getting my tongue tied of an evening. Basically, what that means is that if you are subject to a privacy-related incident, now it may be a cyber attack, but it may just be, one of your practitioners has left a briefcase on the bus. Equally, that is also a data breach. But generally, if it is deemed that you've had a breach and there's a risk of harm to the individuals, then there's actually an obligation on the entity, so that's your practice, to notify not only the OAIC, but also the individuals at risk of harm, ideally individually, and sometimes that's not possible, in which case you have to advertise and kind of look at some other strategies. But I just wanted you to be aware that I'm still seeing the occasional practice that doesn't have a data breach response plan, which has been required since 2018. So it's definitely something to check. Do you have it? And if you don't have it, please get one. But the whole point of the exercise is that if you've had a data breach occur, the cyber criminals generally move quite quickly, but not just that, they share the stolen data amongst their friends, and the stolen identities tend to float around online for quite some time, up to even a number of years. And so if you make your patients aware that you've had an incident, it just makes sure that they can be on high alert, looking out for any suspicious transactions on their credit cards, any funny letters that have come in the mail, any strange emails that they might have otherwise sort of dismissed or put down to spam. It's just alerts everyone so that they can take a little bit of more protection and awareness to protect themselves if they are aware that their information has been involved in some sort of a breach. Because once that horse is bolted, there's not a lot you can do except to make them aware, because it's highly unlikely, or I would almost say impossible, for you to know that you've got your information back. Again, not going to spend a lot of time on compliance. I've left this slide here just so it's in the slide deck and you have it available over the course of the time, but it's not just the Privacy Act, it's also the Corporations Act. If you're a director, I think it's really important to remember that under the Corporations Act, you've got some statutory liability there, not to mention your common law contracts, your ethics, with all of your professional bodies, and of course your accreditation standards. One thing that is often missed is requirements under other common law contracts. So if you've got any tenders or grants, or sometimes as part of your insurance policy, they have quite specific privacy and or data breach requirements. So always something to watch out for there as well. But as I said, I'm trying to focus on the practical, but I wouldn't be doing my due diligence if I didn't have at least one slide on compliance. The main thing that I wanted you to take away is that all of us have an obligation to take reasonable steps to protect the privacy of our patients. And that especially means data this day and age as well. And the OAIC has been quite clear that reasonable steps includes having a data breach policy and response plan that includes notifying impacted individuals if there's been risk of serious harm, which we'll get to in a moment. In terms of current trends, I imagine most of you have heard of some of these. So, but one thing I think that is new and what I wanted to put on here is every year or so, the government, through the Australian Signals Directorate and a couple of other government entities, they run a website called cyber.gov.au, which is a fabulous resource if you haven't already been on there. And they publish a report, and it shows you all of the current trends and risks and what's happening in the nation, mostly based on people reporting. So obviously the data can be a bit skewed, but I was really, I was going to say pleased, and I don't mean pleased, but what I mean is I was really interested to see that the number one current trend on their list was exploitation of pandemic environment, which is absolutely what I've been seeing in consulting practice as well. And what we mean by that is that the coronavirus pandemic has really changed the environment in two ways. Firstly, they're targeting your practice and also your patients with really hyper-specific COVID information. Click here for information on the latest vaccines, or malicious emails that purport to be official pandemic communication. So I wanted to make you aware of that and to be on the lookout for those. The other thing is, a lot of us have been, and including my company as well, have been required to flex. So We've got people working from home. We've got a more of a distributed workforce. I've even heard of some doctors now that we've got a lot of telehealth item numbers available practicing from overseas or on holidays or their holiday house. And we had to pivot to that arrangement quite quickly in order to remain trading. But what we didn't really have time to do was update all of our systems and policies and procedures and security practices to match that. So you've got all of these people working from home with computers and devices that were intended to be either in the practice or certainly not at home for the long term, running over maybe remote desktop protocol, perhaps a VPN if you've been a bit more thorough. But I would like, out of everything on this slide, I just want you to have a think about any changes that may have occurred in your practice over the last couple of years due to the pandemic, and think about if you've actually had that really carefully reviewed, especially people remoting in. If you have any on-premise software such as Best Practice or Medical Director that is hosted at your practice, as in physically, like you've got a server room or rack, I want you to really scrutinize how people are remoting in, because it's the at-home workforce that is just ripe for the picking, especially if they're using their own devices. We strongly discourage, and I've almost make it a rule for my clients, if you're going to work with us, I'm sorry, we cannot allow personal devices. It's just too big a risk. But obviously that's a business decision for everyone to make, but that was the main point of this slide. Ransomware, I hope you're familiar with. Please put in the chat if you're not, and I'm happy to explain it. Software updated is not something that you have control of in a lot of ways, in that there's inherent flaws in the software design that they have to continually keep pushing out fixes for, almost like a band-aid. But it's if you don't update it in a timely manner that becomes a problem, because the malicious criminals advertise online on forums. It's a whole industry. There's literal call centers and associations of criminals and so forth that are running this whole industry behind the scenes. And as soon as they find a weakness in any kind of software, whether Windows is the most common, of course, they advertise that to all of their friends. And so if you're not updating your software, you're leaving yourself really exposed. But the main ones are, other than the pandemic environment I wanted to talk about, was number 4 and number 5, which is more and more often we're starting to see practices, or any organization for that matter, having an incident or being, what's the best good way to put this, dragged down? So I'm not sure, it's not very eloquent of me, but being let down by your supply chain. And by your supply chain, I mean your vendors. So that's all the software companies, your managed service provider, whoever's, anyone in providing software or services to your business, accounts payable, outsourced accounts payable, that type of thing. Unfortunately, the OAIC and the statutory bodies have made it very clear that you cannot contract out of your obligations and your responsibility for the data. And so if one of your suppliers makes a mistake or gets breached, that can have a flow-on effect to your practice. And even though you may not be held liable for the breach itself, it will still trigger potentially a data breach response for you, because through no fault of your own, this software has had a breach, and now all of a sudden all of your patients are impacted. And unfortunately, that means it's your practice name on the front page of the paper, your practice name having to do all of the notifications and contacting theoretically and potentially every individual in your database, which can be a really big issue. So we're going to talk a little bit today about perhaps scrutinizing our suppliers a little bit more closely. And the last one is business email compromise, which just means that someone untoward or non-authorized has access to one of your corporate organization email accounts, which we're going to look at in a little bit more detail shortly. And I must admit, up until a couple of years ago, I was sitting pretty at a very beautiful practice group up in Cairns, being a practice manager. And I thought, yes, good, I've done all the protections. What are the chances of that happening to me? 1 in a billion. And I'm very, very sorry to say that unfortunately, health service providers, according to the government cyber report seems to be the #1 target, or at least we're the #1 sector notifying of data breaches as of 2021, which was the most recent report available. They haven't published 2022 yet. Now that could mean one of two things. That either means we're a really big target because our data is so valuable compared to the other sectors, or it means that we are so onto it and we're so patient focused and meticulous as practice managers and GPs and MSPs that when we are having an incident, we're actually reporting and the others just aren't reporting it. But either way, I suspect it's a combination of both, that we are really good at compliance and accreditation and so forth, and so we're reporting, but by the same token, we also hold some of the more specific, more valuable data that is a real target for criminals. And the other thing that report showed, which was really interesting, was sources of data breach. So about half of malicious or criminal attack, a little bit of system fault, and about 41% human error. And the reason I put this slide here is that I've seen a lot of investment and a lot of effort put into the malicious or criminal attack side of the equation, and not a lot of effort put into the staff training, human factor side of the equation. So even though you may have a great Sophos firewall in place, or you've got all the best policies in the world, I'm yet to walk into a practice that has actually done proper training in terms of cyber awareness and privacy and confidentiality. That's not true. I do know some that have done privacy and confidentiality, but not many that have done cyber. I'm sure they're out there. I just haven't come across them yet, and maybe that's why they're contacting me. But I just wanted to point that out. In terms of the actual incident breakdown, and I am taking you on a bit of a journey here, so bear with me. Interesting to see here, we've got everything from ransom, hacking, malware, phishing. I think, and again, a lot of people are focused on the hacking and the ransomware, but I want you to look at the rest of the circle. So compromised or stolen passwords, 28%. But interestingly, phishing is just kind of another form of compromised passwords. Brute force, again, also kind of just the same thing, compromised passwords, as in someone using legitimate username and password to get access to your systems. And so I've gone ahead and just consolidated that. Passwords, username and passwords related to 65% of incidents in the latest report, and everything else combined was only 35%. And yet it's the 35% where we're focusing all of our attention, and passwords and logins in practices, I see them in notebooks, I've seen them on stick notes, I see them in spreadsheets and all over the place. They're generally not, in my view, could be managed better or not managed well. And I don't think that they get the attention that they deserve. So that was a lot of talking from me, and that is our foundations covered. So well done, you've made it through the first section. And I'd now like to move into a bit of a scenario, if it's okay with you. Now, in this scenario, there may be people making comments in the chat, or examples may be raised, and I've got what I call Chatham House rules, which means that you're more than welcome to take that for your learning and knowledge, but I really would prefer if we can keep everything as de-identified as possible. Certainly, if any specifics come up, please keep that between us and between everyone on the recording, I suppose. But just, yes, please don't reveal identity or affiliation if possible. So I'd like now to move into a scenario which I'm keen to hear your thoughts on, actually. So I'll give you a moment. If you want to read the scenario at home on your own device, you can. I've given you the QR code there on the slides. You don't have to. I'm going to read through it anyway, but if it's easier for you to follow along at home, or if you're on the recording later in the year and you'd like to have a read, the QR code is there, and it is available on that website that I mentioned at the start of the recording, emphn.honestally.com.au. All right, so the scenario is, it's Friday afternoon, right before a long weekend, because that is always when these incidents seem to happen. It's almost like they know. You've had a really busy week and you can't wait to start the weekend, and your phone rings. It's a contractor that you know and that you've dealt with recently, and the contractor have said that they've received a slightly unusual email from one of your employees. The email seemed legitimate enough. It came from someone that they knew, and it was offering to share a file with them through a popular file sharing platform. So, Darcy has shared such and such file with you. And they thought you might want to know just in case it was something malicious or that you should be aware of. Now, it's not uncommon for employees in your business to actually share files through this platform. That's quite normal. But what flags your interest, I guess, is that it's a bit odd that this particular employee would be speaking with this contractor. So the email's legitimate, both parties are legitimate, the software invitation that's been sent in itself is theoretically legitimate, but party A talking to party B kind of doesn't really make a lot of sense. I think in this example, it was so I'm just trying to keep it de-identified. It was a person working in a part of the business, for example, an accounts payable person writing to maybe a gardener. Like, it just didn't make sense, the connection there. So that's kind of what flagged the call. You've spoken with the employee and they tell you they've got absolutely no idea what you're talking about, and they didn't send any such email. In fact, you think they were actually on leave the day that this was supposedly sent. And the employee in question, whose email it was supposedly sent from, is the practice intake, like the admissions person. So they deal with all the paperwork from patients coming into the organisation for receiving their healthcare. So the email looks a little bit like this. So this is the actual email. I've had to redact it because this is an actual screenshot. Now, the reason I came to be involved is my organisation, Honest Ally, we do cyber incident response. And so that's how I have access to the screenshots and scenarios. And so this is the actual screenshot that was sent. So it was a OneNote file and the file names were all correct. So it was a file that you would expect to be sent. It all looked pretty legitimate when we had a look at it. And so my question for the group now is, do you think this is a risk, and what would your next steps be? And we'll see. Hopefully we've got some people who are prepared to help me. Does anyone want to have a go? I promise I won't single you out.
There's nothing that's come through yet, Darcy. I'll let you know if somebody does type something.
Wait, or shall I report the breach? Okay. So we've got one suggesting that we would report the breach. Any other ideas or options for how to proceed? Has this happened to anyone? Has anyone ever had something like this happen in their practice? Check the link. Yep, good option. I would be deleting the email if there was anything sus with the connections, and change passwords immediately. Okay, you're all definitely on the right track. And we've got a couple of things going on here. So one is change passwords immediately, which will park for the moment. I'm just going to come back to that in a moment, Stephen, but yes, I agree with you, you're right. But before we do that, yes, it was also your suggestion to say, check the link, which I agree. Now, the issue that we had was, I said to the staff member, okay, well, to be honest, I don't really want to click on that link because I don't really want my computer to be infected in case yours was. What happened when you clicked it? And the employee said to me, oh, nothing, Darcy. I got a Windows login, like, because it was a Windows. Windows is not at fault here, by the way, necessarily. It just happened to be Microsoft Windows. And she said, yeah, I got a share login. This is the exact page that I was taken to, which we took a screenshot of. And I said, oh, what happened? You put in your password, and did a crypto lock come up or anything like that? She said, no, nothing happened. I put in my username and password, and I just I got this error message that just nothing happened. And I said, oh, okay, that's interesting. The email was so, hyper realistic, actually, that we ended up sending it because someone said check the email address. Now the email address was correct. It was an actual correct email address from inside the business. It's a bit like one of those horror movies where your home phone's ringing and on your caller ID it's coming from in your own house. That's kind of what it felt like. So the email address was correct. The user reported that they clicked the link and nothing happened. And so they just moved on with their day. And I said, well, when did this happen? They said, oh, a couple of weeks ago. I said, really? A couple of weeks ago? So yeah, but nothing happened. So we thought, right, well, we need to find out my suggestion of what to do next, which is I think what a few of you are getting at, just not quite as succinctly as this, is we need to investigate and figure out what is this email? And the point of this exercise is that I think it's very easy for people to get an email like that. You put in your credentials, nothing happened, you move on with your day. And that's what this lady did. So we had been working for a number of weeks with this risk, and no one was the wiser. And I think that this could happen to you, or your users, wouldn't know that this risk had happened. The problem is it's hard for you to click on it and investigate it because you don't want to infect your own system. And so I would strongly encourage you need to get your managed service provider involved at this point. Or what we do, we're involved in this industry, so we actually have a really dummy, like a very low quality computer that we have totally separated off our network, and I sent it to that and opened it on that because if that got infected or something, I wasn't concerned. So like a test environment, essentially. So we did a little bit of investigating, which would be definitely my first step, because we need to understand what we're dealing with. Is this really a risk? We found out that this email did come from this employee's account, like legitimately. It wasn't like someone pretending to be them. It came from inside the account. It was sent to at least 750 external recipients, so patients, suppliers, other healthcare organizations, quite deliberately, I would suggest, to other healthcare organizations in the hope that they would click it as well. A number of people clicked it internally as well over a number of weeks and didn't report it because nothing happened. So nothing happened. There is no risk. They didn't see the risk. And it turns out that when we sent this email for examination, what happens is that when you enter in your password into this box and you get the error message that says, oh, sorry, it didn't work, that's actually been harvested. That's been logged on a spreadsheet somewhere by a nefarious person. And basically, every single person that does that, they just log it in a big spreadsheet and they sell them. And they use it to access your system and see what else is in there that they might want to steal or do. This particular organization did not have multi-factor authentication in place. And that's when you might have that with your banking, where you get a text message with a code when you're trying to log in, or you might have an app on your phone that requires you to enter in a code. So that's multi-factor. But this group did have everything else done right. They had the latest firewall, they had all the antivirus, they had a MSP that was industry recommended. But as we were investigating, we did start getting more phone calls from patients and concerned people that they were starting to get sort of strange communication and correspondence, but reception didn't realize the seriousness of that and just sort of didn't tell anyone until I went and asked them. It wasn't reported up the chain. And again, no one kind of knew anything about it, but when I went and spoke to some people privately and in tea rooms and things, they all reported receiving similar emails, and a lot of them had clicked on it and put their credentials in, including the CFO as well, because it was that realistic and it was authentic. It wasn't actually spam. It did actually come from within the organization. So while it was malicious, it was in some ways sort of legitimate from an IT perspective because it was sent from an actual account. So at this point, there's a lot of confusion about this email and the impact. And so the MSP, the managed service provider, so it's the people looking after the IT for the business, who, keep in mind, have been hired to safeguard this business. So I do think there is a bit of an inherent conflict there. And they're saying, look, yep, we know that some passwords, may have gone out, but you've got the latest antivirus. We can't see anything obviously wrong. It's our suggestion, and this is where we come to the change passwords. Thank you, Barb. That we just change the password of the affected account or accounts, and move on with our lives. Case closed. Done deal. Change the password, move on. Does anyone have any thoughts as to if that's an appropriate course of action, or is that what you would do? Keeping in mind it's what your managed service provider is recommending as well. Okay, so a couple of questions here. I'm curious, why did nothing happen for a few weeks? What triggered them contacting you, and how did you even know which email it was? And Stephen's made a really good point, which is no, changing the passwords and moving on is not satisfactory. You need to mitigate the risk. Firstly, 100% agree with Stephen. That is exactly right. That's exactly right. What about external people? So all of our patients and other suppliers who've received this email, we've not warned them in any way that this has happened, because while this is all going on, they could be clicking on the link themselves. And so all of our colleagues and partners are falling prey to this as well. As for Stephanie's question, why nothing happened for weeks is a fascinating question. And how I knew which email it was a fascinating question too. The only way I knew which email account was affected is that I was one of those 750 recipients. So the irony of their cybersecurity consultant getting this malicious email sent from one of my clients, I rang up my client straight away and said, hey guys, something's going on. But if it was anyone else who got that email, they may not have known. So that's how we knew where to start looking. Just to be clear, I was not there doing cybersecurity consulting at the time. I was there on another job, but yes, I was the one that found it and reported it. And the reason nothing happened for weeks is the most alarming thing was that in the end, actually, I'm not going to spoil that. I'm going to park that question. Let's come back to that. Why did nothing happen for a few weeks? And is this a reportable data breach? And that's right. And this is a real world situation that actually happened last year, and this could be you tomorrow. So this is why I wanted to kind of go through it, and so we can see what the issues. So, and I'm loving the chat. Thank you, Stephen and Barb and all of those who are participating. Is this a reportable data breach? And that's exactly where I was going next. So under the Act, what is a data breach? An eligible data breach is unauthorized access, disclosure, or loss of personal information by your practice. So that's gateway number one. Once you pass through gateway number one, second gateway, resulting in serious harm to your patients. Now, this seems really straightforward. Great, you have a data breach, there's a risk to our patients, let's report it. But I'm here today to tell you that it is anything but clear. I love the idea of this legislation and this data breach scheme. I think it's fantastic, but this wording leaves a lot to be desired, let me put it that way. So firstly, have we or hadn't we had a data breach? And to be honest, well, we don't really know. We know that a malicious email was sent around. We're pretty sure that that came from inside the organization, but it's a very preliminary, precursory view at the moment. There is an argument, so my argument is access. So I would say, okay, well, you've had an email account accessed. You don't know if it was stolen, but it was accessed, and they do have the word access in the definition. So, okay, that's gateway number one, especially the nature of this person's account as well. I think if it had been, like if it had been the gardener's account and there was very little personal information in there because the nature of that work was different to, it was incredibly unfortunate and possibly targeted by the malicious actor people that the admissions person, the generic admin admissions email account, was the one that was compromised. So basically it held the personal information of every patient that had ever interacted with that business because it never got cleared out. So then the next gate is, okay, so we've had access. So my personal views are that we're kind of meeting the definition there, but then is it resulting in serious harm to your patients? Well, who's to say? We don't know if they just sent the email and logged out, or whether they've taken a copy of the entire database and they're still in our network right now as we speak. Who knows? And we genuinely didn't know. And this is the message that I've got for you today, is that the data breach plan and scheme is all very good in theory, but you've got a couple of grey areas there that just are really hard to manage. So I've got, if you're all happy to have a look, if you've bought your own data breach plan with you, bring it out now. If you haven't got one, then don't worry, there is a QR code there that you can scan to activate our data breach plan, because that's what they're there for, right? So if you've got an incident like this, the OAIC has said from 2018 that you're supposed to have this plan, so that, because you've only got 30 days to notify. There is a statutory deadline of 30 days. So we will, you go to your plan, and that should give you everything that you need to deal with the incident. Now, has anyone had a go at getting that plan up? No. All right, well, I have one on the next slide that we got. Oh, sorry, I thought I saw a chat there, but I might not. I've got a lot happening on my screens at this end. All right, so we might then move on to one I've prepared earlier. So let me have a look here. This was the slide we had a bit of trouble with earlier, so please bear with me. Okay, now I'm hoping you're all seeing a data breach response plan on the screen.
Yes, Darcy, it's come on.
Fantastic. Now, this is a template that we borrowed from one of our colleagues, and this is the kind of templated data breach response plan that you would just find online, and I suspect a lot of yours may look something like this. So we've had this data breach, we're in the thick of it. Now, keep in mind, reception's a bit stressed, people are starting to call. Darcy from Honest Ally has come in and started asking all these questions. So we're going to go to our plan. And the plan says notify director. Cool, done that. Director to assess the breach. Okay, well, that's a bit hard because we really don't have any information at this point. We've got, theoretically, this would be populated with your data breach response team, but it seems a lot to kind of get them together. At the moment, all we've got is an email. We don't sort of know how serious it is. So we'll go down to step 1. Contain the breach and do a preliminary assessment. Okay, what information does the breach involve? We don't know. What was the cause of the breach? Don't know. Extent of the breach? Don't know. Harms to affected persons? I mean, potentially identity theft, if anything was taken, but we don't know if it was. How can the breach be contained? Well, we don't know, because we don't know if it was taken. And I don't know if you guys are picking up on what I'm trying to say, but I just think that a lot of these plans don't hold a lot of value on the coalface at the start. They're great to have, but I think more time and effort needs to be put into them, is kind of what I'm saying. And that's why I've given you on the website a lessons learned register, so that we can try and take those lessons learned and enhance all of our data breach response plans. So evaluating the risks. So we do know that there was personal information in the account. That's what we do know. And we do know that it was highly medical because it was admissions. But we have no information on the cause or the extent of the breach at this point. We don't know who's been in. So it makes it very, very hard to assess this risk of serious harm. I just find that a hard decision to make. And if you can't make that decision, then we've kind of circled back around to Stephen and Barb's question, which is, well, do we notify or not? And then prevent future breaches. So step 1, contain the breach. Okay, cool. Well, so the reality of what we're going to do next is we're going to try and follow the plan as best we can. And we're still stuck in this situation of, do we report or don't we report? And we're kind of concurrently trying to mitigate at the same time. Just excuse my weird, quirky sense of humor there. You get used to me after a while. And so first things first, someone mentioned, okay, well, let's change the passwords. So in this particular organization, we had 297 users. And we need to change their passwords because we don't know. We've heard on the grapevine and in the tea room and through our colleagues that quite a lot of people clicked on this link and shared their credentials. I mean, they didn't tell anyone because nothing happened, but we know that those logins and passwords have been sitting on some criminal's database for up to a number of weeks. Now, this is the scary part, and this is where we come back to an earlier question, which is Stephanie's question, which is, why did nothing happen for weeks? The reason nothing happened for weeks is they take those stolen passwords and logins, they log into your business without you knowing, and they sit there for weeks, if not months, up to, I think the last cyber report I read said something like 6 to 8 months was the average. And they harvest every possible piece of data they can get out of your business. They look for any weak points. They'll be going through your drives. They'll be going from one account, send the phishing link to another person into that account. So the minute that CFO put their credentials in, then all of a sudden they're having a heyday. And they don't want you to be aware. They want to be as secret as possible because they know the first thing you're going to do is change all the passwords. So they want to keep that really, really, really quiet. And then once they've sucked every ounce of information possible out of your system, they think, well, because keep in mind, they want to sell these records. They want to get identities and they want to sell them for $1,000 each. That's one of the goals of this particular threat. And there's lots of threats out there, but this is common. This is business email compromise. We're talking about BEC. You'll hear it referred to. And you know, I'm a nefarious criminal. I don't have morals. So I'm going to steal everything that you've got. And then I've sold it to my mate down the road. And then the next thing I do is I crypto lock your whole network, which is where ransomware comes in, which is where you get that big message on your screen with the countdown. It says, we have locked your computers. And unless you pay us, you know, $1,000 Bitcoin, you know, we won't give you your data back. Because the minute I do that, you know that I exist. And you're going to call your MSP and you're going to start locking me out, or you're going to revert to your backup or something like that. So the crypto lock is like my last ditch effort, my last big hurrah to be able to make even more money, criminally, obviously, out of you and your practice from this incident. And this started from a single user clicking on that one link, that one time, almost a month ago at this point. So I don't want to freak you out, but I want to highlight how serious it can be. And the whole point of this exercise is that these small things that happen in your day, take them, I'm just encouraging you to please take them as seriously as I do. It seems far-fetched. And when you ring your managed service provider, and I rang the managed service provider, keeping in mind, they said, look, change the password and move on. That was their official advice in writing. And I said, hey guys, like, seriously? And they said, no, it's not a big deal. Just change the passwords. We've actually had a number of clients that this has happened to in the last month. I thought, oh yeah, I bet you did. And you know, and it's because all of their clients are in a similar database, so they get in and they email each other. So that kind of makes sense. But the MSP was responsible for securing that network. And I would put to you, they are great people. I love working with them, but I genuinely felt that they made a big effort to downplay the seriousness of the risks and the issues. When we went to find out, okay, well, how did you know Stephanie's email address? How did you know which email it was? Like, how did you know what happened? Well, normally you go in and you check the logs. There's like background logging that happens. And in this case, that was switched off. So for Microsoft, anyone on a Windows, Microsoft, this was the Microsoft 365 situation, out of the box, those things are switched off by default. So you've had to go out of your way to turn it on, which they had not done. And all of this could have been prevented if multi-factor authentication was in place, which it wasn't. There was also a few other issues with their settings that I was pretty unimpressed with. And I had those discussions quite openly, because it's a great thing about being a consultant is I can kind of have those hard conversations. But so that put me on edge because I'm thinking, well, I've got these concerns. You know, I've been to Darcy's privacy training. I get what some of the risks could be. Now, they may not have done that, but they may have done that. And you don't know. And even trying to change the passwords, we couldn't email the staff to change their passwords because we might alert, if they are in the system, we might alert them that we know that they're there. And of course, what are they going to do? Trigger a crypto lock. So we had to try and figure out a way to notify the 300 staff that we were changing their passwords on a Friday night without them knowing. So when they came in on the Saturday, no one would be able to log in. So anyway, in the end, we thought, well, okay, we'll text them because we can't use our own email system. And then, of course, we didn't have a single database of clean mobile numbers. They were spread across, like rostering was split from payroll. And yeah, we just couldn't communicate. Because we couldn't use the email, we couldn't use our own systems because they were impacted, and we couldn't risk a ransomware attack until we had done some more backups and made a few more checks and did a few more hunting on what might be going on. So then I rang the OAIC, and they were not as helpful as you would think. I kind of expected them to be giving us templates and helping guide us through the process. It really wasn't like that at all. It was like, hey, no, look, we're the enforcer. Thanks for reporting. Good luck. And they weren't as rude like that. It's just, it's not their function. They're just kind of there to run the reporting. But they, my goodness, they were onto me like a police force. They said, okay, you must have, you know, they were great. They reassured me we were on the right track. They said, no, this is a serious risk. You are right not to downplay it. And we think that you should be notifying. And we want you to do it by this date. And on that date, at exactly the time they said, they called me and they were like, Darcy, have you done it yet? Why haven't you done it? Can we see it? Can we see your privacy policy? Have you done this? Have you done that? They were on to me. The OAIC was helpful to a point, but mainly they were concerned with compliance and was I going to be meeting those dates and deadlines. So I'm aware I'm running a bit over time, but are you guys happy for me to stay on the scenario for a bit longer, or do you want me to wrap up and move on to the next
No, we have the
session,
webinar open till 8 o'clock, Darcy, so please continue.
Fantastic. So the next stakeholder was the insurer. Now, if you haven't got insurance, I would strongly recommend that it's something that you look at. But I, like in my mind, I thought, okay, great. We've got this cyber insurance that we paid a fair bit for. I think it was about I've seen between $1,500 and sort of $5,000 a year, depending on the size of the practice. It was fascinating. We rang them, and on the front of your policy, it says, oh, if you sign up for an insurance policy with us, we'll give you a cyber breach response team. And you think, oh yeah, that sounds good. Because of course the insurance company wants to, you know, mitigate their losses. So, but it's our interests are aligned in that regard. So that's fine. But it took 6 days for the cyber team to even be approved by the insurer. And you'll notice on this timeline that the 30-day OAIC deadline to notify all the patients, all the stakeholders, was 20 August. Now, I didn't get a preliminary forensic report until the 2nd of September. That's day 44. And the claim wasn't even accepted for 51 days. So for 51 days, the practice was incurring all of this cost. They had consultants, there was MSPs involved, patients were ringing, we had to do a call center. It kind of got a bit out of hand, and they had no idea whether their insurance company was going to come to the party or not until day 51, where they did actually eventually accept the claim. But man, were we scrutinized. Why did you do this? Why did you do that? Did you do everything possible to mitigate your loss? Oh, no, sorry. We think that you should have had multi-factor authentication in place from day one. Like, that's just industry best practice. Why didn't you have that? The fact that you put that in, that's what we call betterment. That's not included in your policy. So the total claim ended up being about 100 grand, and I have rounded just to keep it simple, with approximately $25,000 what I've called a write-down, which is all the things the insurance company said, no, you know, you should have done this differently, or you should have had MFA in place at the start, or, you know, you should have known better, basically. And then finally, on day 65, we got a little bit more information because we had put special forensic software on the network to find out like what might have been going on, and exactly what we thought was going on. We didn't get a definitive answer, but it's possible. Well, basically, we still don't know. The forensic report kind of said, there's definitely risks there, but we can't confirm or deny because your audit tools were switched off. And then finally, 128 days, the reduced settlement was paid. So that was really interesting as well. In terms of Honest Ally's involvement, you're kind of like, okay, well, Darcy, what are you doing there in all of this? It's not even your practice. The organization, I was there by coincidence, to be honest, because I happened to get this email and rang up the practice manager and said, hey, like, I'm pretty concerned about this email. But they quickly became overwhelmed because keep in mind during all of this that they're still seeing patients. Like, we didn't close, and they run a almost 24-hour business. They run all weekend and everything. So they just couldn't deal. They just didn't have enough internal resources to manage this. Now, I'm not saying you should call us, and this is the point of this exercise is not to do advertising for Honest Ally, so please don't get me wrong. All I'm saying is have a think about if this were to happen to you, and it could tomorrow, do you have the resources and do you have someone that you can call on? And that might be your managed service provider, but you might want to have a bit of a plan in place, because I think most people's systems assume that they're going to have their phones and emails, and you may not. This particular scenario, we did have everything other than email, but I've got a second scenario that I sometimes use, which was for the client before that one, and they had nothing. So imagine trying to do this and you've got to see your patients, notify your entire database and your staff, and you have no email, no phones, potentially no website, depending on how that's been done. And so Honest Ally provided basically all of that. We did our own call center, we did an independent website, we basically hosted everything with us while this all got sorted out, and we did the insurance claim and stakeholder management for them as well, and media liaison to try and take pressure off the CEO and practice manager, because they were trying to run the business. So have a think about if you've got enough resources to manage a situation like this and what you would do if something like that occurred. You don't have, there's other people like us and other consultants and companies out there, or some MSPs now even have a subscription service that you can sign up to, like managed cybersecurity, that helps with this sort of thing as well. So just something to consider. How are we all feeling after the scenario? That is the end of the scenario. Was that helpful and gave you some things to think about what a real world situation might be like? I'm watching that chat. It's all very quiet on the Eastern Front. I've lost my friend Stephen.
Very quiet, Darcy.
Very quiet. Well, we might move on. I won't force you. It is getting late. So I'm hoping that wasn't meant to scare you, but it was. Oh, thank you. That wasn't meant to scare you, but it is a real situation, and that's literally exactly what happened. The other thing was, notifying the patients. In best practice at the time, there was a feature where, so I think there was about 30,000 people in the database that we were considering notifying, and we couldn't email because our email was down. And so we thought, oh, great, text message would be a great option. And the software allowed that. So we bought, it was about $6,500 worth of SMS credit in the end. And then we were unable to send the text message because not everyone had ticked that I agree to be SMS'd privacy box, ironically. And so then we ended up having to employ the software provider to write a custom script for us that ran on the server and ticked all of the allow SMS boxes, sent the notification SMS, and then ran another script to go and put all the tick boxes back to how they were before. And all of that, as you can imagine, the 30-day deadline in every incident I've been involved with has not been met by the time all of these things happen. I don't know about you, but the point I was trying to make was I suspect a lot of data breach. Oh, hang on, Darcy, very useful. Cost money to protect the business. We do so based on financial means, how to balance between costs protection versus cost of remediation. Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think that every business is going to be in a different financial situation. I've got some tips coming up. Some are more cost effective than others, so see what you think. But think that if it's becoming non-optional, so if it's not in the budget, it needs to be in the budget. And look, that's a business decision for everyone to make, but for our clients that we've been working with, we have ended up, the costs of not doing it far outweigh the costs of the mitigating actions. So it is a gauntlet that we're running, and they ended up having to spend both. So they ended up having to spend all the mitigating costs, so that those people had a $100,000 claim. Admittedly, all but 25 grand, we ended up 128 days getting it back from insurance. But then the insurance company wouldn't pay for what's called betterment. So we couldn't just walk away, because the same thing would happen again the next week, because the criminals will tell their friends. So then they ended up having to spend all the money to bring them up to scratch anyway. So they had both. They had the cost of the incident and the cost to bring them up to scratch. And they literally had no choice, because they had the OAIC, ASIC, and all these other reporting bodies kind of breathing down our necks, saying, you've missed a 30-day deadline, what are you doing? So whilst it's optional, it's also kind of not optional. Yeah, I agree. So on the chat, if you're not watching the chat, it's 20 years ago, practices did not have an IT budget, and now we need to consider a cybersecurity budget item. Yeah, I do think you need to consider that. It may not be practical for everyone, but I just think the time's come, and I've got some ideas for you of how you can do it. I was going to say it doesn't have to be expensive. I think anything in GP land is expensive at the moment, but let's have a look at some short, medium, long-term strategies and see what you think at the end of that. And depending, we can always have an offline conversation as well on your practice specifics, if I can think of anything kind of helpful and cheap and easy for your particular situation. So yeah, don't underestimate the practical issues of having a breach. Even things like sending an SMS will not be straightforward potentially. And so I think these response plans could do with a lot of work. We have got a harm threshold built into all of ours now, which helps the decision maker decide if there has been serious harm or not, with examples and thresholds. So it helps the decision making in a situation like that much easier. And to be honest with you, most of the time you're not going to know. And so we've built in clauses into all of our response plans that say, if there's any uncertainty at all, if the answer is I don't know or I'm not sure, then that means you report, and that triggers the report function. Now I'm realize that that's a lot to take in, and you're right. I think that the money investment issue in practice is a really big issue at the moment, and we've all got a lot of things already in place, such as secure messaging and confidential waste disposal. But I have a very unpopular opinion, potentially, I guess, in that I feel that probably what we're doing isn't enough anymore, and that what was reasonable in even in 2019 is probably not possibly reasonable in 2022, given that we've got all these extra issues from the pandemic and changes in software and people working from home and all sorts of things. So I wanted to give you short, medium, and long-term strategies, because all of you will be sitting at different places with different budgets and different means. And don't go away thinking that you have to do all of these things. I'm here to just plant the seed of ideas, essentially. By the way, all of these ideas I've given to you on that website. There is a checklist, and it's got a summary of all of these ideas and a checklist for you. So don't worry, it's all there for you. So I thought initially we'll look at some short-term quick wins that don't necessarily have to be expensive, depending on how you define expensive. And so I wanted to take you through those now. Basically, I wanted to give you some foundations of IT, and I didn't know what people's IT literacy levels would be. So please bear with me. I've tried to make this as simple as possible. And if there's anything anyone doesn't understand, please let me know. And if you do have a lot of IT knowledge and this is too simplified, then I apologize to you as well. But this is basically a diagram of a traditional network. So your practice is over in the right-hand side. You've got an SQL database, which could be something like best practice or medical director. It's where all your data is held, and you've got all of your files. And you've got this perimeter around it, which is the dotted line, which is sort of like your network edge. So that might be, outside of your practice. And it's hopefully, at least this day, protected by a firewall. If you don't have a firewall, that is a major problem, and you should talk to your MSP straight away about getting a medical industry grade firewall in place, such as a Sophos or a Fortinet. You might have heard some of these words. And people access your systems using a password and login. And if they're offsite, they may have a VPN. So I'm hoping that this kind of model is ringing a few bells and looking familiar to some people. Now, what I want to point out about this is that this entire model basically relies on mostly, not only, but the big linchpin of this approach is the username and password to log in. And we already know from the first section of this presentation that over half of incidents relate to compromised usernames and passwords. So we've got this huge kind of weak point in the chain, which is the human beings trying to manage these theoretical username and passwords. So the way I want you to think of it in really, really layperson terms is that your medical practice network computer system is like a castle. So you're at your medical practice, you're in the castle, and you have spent a lot of money fortifying the network perimeter. So trying to keep people out of your network. So your firewalls, your VPNs, your software, everything there is trying to protect your network, which is great. And that's to be commended. I think that is a really great thing to do. But there is an inherent flaw in traditional networks in that once you're in the network, there is not as much protection. There is some protections, but they've got what's called implicit trust, which is if you've ever kind of walked into a building and those blue internet cords that are everywhere, if you plugged your computer into that blue internet cord, you'd probably have some kind of access depending on how they've set up their systems. And so a traditional network assumes there is an actual boundary, whether that be the geographic boundary of your practice, but more the geographic the physical boundaries of your network. And all of the investment is in the perimeter to keep people out. But once you're in, then suddenly there's a lot less protections available because you passed the firewall, you passed all those safeguards because potentially you've got the username and password because one of your staff members put it in one of these dodgy emails. You know what I mean? And they're in straight away. Like, what happens then? So I wanted to show you a different way. So keep that in mind, and that model is going to be hard to shift from. So I thought, well, what can we take back to our practices to make a few quick wins? And I would suggest that your biggest one, this is my sense of humor again, like shorts for short term. Anyway, I even color matched it, but is password management would be my suggestion, is your first, and backups as well. So you're going to have passwords in your practice potentially that do, hopefully you have a password policy. If you don't, that's definitely something to consider. But in 2022, still in the top, I think it's in the top 5 most common passwords in the world is this: I love you. And you will all know some people in your business that potentially have passwords like this. And you'll go to your managed service provider and they will say things to you like, okay, well, it needs to be, 8 characters long. It needs to have hieroglyphics. It needs to have a special character. It needs to be changed every 4th Thursday on a full moon. And you can never, ever reuse the same password again on anything. And your users will go, yeah, cool, we understand the risks. And our response is this. And they just meet your complexity requirements by kind of not meeting them. And so then this is you or your MSP's response kind of saying, okay, well, that really defeats the purpose of the exercise. But what I'm trying to say is it's all about human experience. And if we know that over 60% of incidents related to compromised passwords, what can we do to just make it easier for people? On average, according to Lastpass, which they provide password management software, the average user has 191 passwords. I ran a report earlier in the week. I have 235 that I'm supposed to remember and not reuse, and that's just for Honest Ally. That does not include a separate database of my personal passwords. And so what I want you to try and do is when the MSP tells you to make them really complicated and never reuse them and every 2 weeks change them, use a password manager instead. That way you can meet, and I meant to say this little notebook here is, so my mum's a specialist doctor, and that's her password system, which works for her. And the point of that story is that whilst I think that there are better ways to manage passwords, her focus needs to be on the patient. She doesn't have time to be going around and messing around with 200 different passwords. She also works at 4 different hospitals across the state, each one of them with different credentials. And it's just not humanly possible for her to meet the password policies that we're asking of her and still not compromise care to the patient and keep that as her priority. So that was the point of that picture. So what I want you to look at is potentially a password manager and what's called single sign-on. Now, they're 2 different things, and I want to show you how they work. Now, this is called single sign-on, and there's a lot of information in the resources about this. Your software provider has to support it, so it's not something that you can just go and do tomorrow. But what I want you to do is have a procurement strategy that in the future, you only buy software that has what's called single sign-on, and that you lobby your current providers to support it. Because what that means is you log in once in the morning. We're encouraging, you can even go passwordless. So some people are doing like biometric, and this is how so these are our applications, but you can imagine if yours were, say, this screen could be Cubico, it could be best practice, and you've logged in the morning, all of the apps that you need are there, and you do not log in to anything else throughout the day. You have one username and password, or potentially even biometric if you want to go passwordless, and that's it. You click on, say, this could be best practice theoretically, or it could be Cubico, or it could be another kind of application. So you've logged into Windows, or we're logging into Google in this example. You click on the app you want, and I wish I hurried up in my example, and it takes you straight into the software. You'll see it's doing a lot of fancy stuff up in the URL there to check my identity, but it's not asking me for a password. And then I'm straight into the application that I need. Now, there is a slight delay because I was on a hotspot when I recorded this example. But what I'm trying to paint a picture for you is that if you have SSO in your applications and it's just switched off, which I often see, it's a great feature that you could be taking advantage of, and you remove the password from the equation entirely, which we've all hopefully agreed is the weak point. And SSO for Canva, Asana, Zoho, all these apps, they don't charge for SSO. It's just, some do, but some don't. So it's definitely worth investigating. Now, you're going to have a lot of apps that don't support SSO, and that's a longer term strategy. So in the meantime, we need to manage these 194 passwords per person on average. And so what I would encourage you to do is have what's called a password manager. I implemented one for a practice here in Hobart last week. It's $54 a year. Admittedly, it probably will end up costing a bit more than that once we flesh it out a bit. But the point I'm trying to make is they're not a huge expense. And what we do is every time a staff member signs up to something, they get a little icon in the box on the right there. You can see we use Zoho Vault, but there's a number of them available on the market, which I've given to you in the resources. And they're not allowed to pick their own password. They have to use a password that the computer generates for them. And that password is in line with Honest Ally policy. So the computer knows what our password policies are, and it will basically generate the password for them. And it'll inject it into the account when they make their account. Now, this may be something that you do when onboarding. So it may not be a doctor or a staff member doing this. It could even be you when you're setting them up as a new start. But basically, it will make a really complex password for you. And then when you want to log in, it will actually log you in every time. So again, you never need to use that password again. This is another example. So I want to get into an application that doesn't have SSO. I click on this link here. Just excuse my other applications there. And then it's going to take me straight in. No password required. And that was $54 for the year for this. And there we go. It's going to take me, I just picked iStock because there's no patient data in there or anything like that. I just picked a mock system. And it takes me in. So it is possible to live a passwordless existence in this world. You just need to have the right tools. The other really good thing, it can be putting all your eggs in one basket because you're putting all your passwords in a password manager, but for that reason, we leave multi-factor authentication still switched on as well. So it's true, it is true. So Stephen's point is, you've literally given all your passwords to this password manager. Are you not putting all your eggs in one basket? Potentially, I guess you've got to balance the risk of using a password manager. To me, the risk of Zoho Vault or LastPass being compromised and all of that being an issue is lower than the risk of all of my users having password one, I love you, changing it every quarter, and also just the efficiencies day to day of not having to log into stuff. It just saves us so much time. The other mitigating strategies we've done is we've got it so that the passwords don't actually leave our browser. I'm getting a bit technical now, but basically the passwords don't, the encryption happens at our end. And what was the other thing I was going to say? Yes, sorry, we leave multi-factor authentication active as well, which does add an extra step. Anyway, I digress. I can chat to you later if you want more info. Yeah, LastPass is another example. So Kirsty uses LastPass and it doesn't cost too much. The other great thing it can do is, at the moment, you probably don't know, or hopefully don't know, what all of your team's passwords are. And the system will not tell you. So the system won't tell you what your staff's password is, but it will give you most of them have a reporting function where you can actually monitor the quality of the passwords in your organization and follow up and send reminders to users who have weak passwords. It will even change it for them. Now, I am conscious of time, so I'm just going to speed through a little bit, and I do apologize. But the other main thing I want you to take away is about backups. If you still have drives or tapes or anything that you have to physically plug in or take out or take away or put in your car, not really acceptable anymore. Times have changed. There are far better, easier systems out there. If you haven't heard of it, now I have no affiliation with any of these people, by the way, I'm just a freelance, but and there are other options. But if you haven't heard of Datto, it is definitely something to talk to your managed service provider about and look into. Absolutely incredible. So all of your data is stored with you on premise in that little Datto black box right there. So you don't have any drives, you don't have to change anything over. It goes instantly in real time. I think it's every 60 seconds or something into that box. If your server dies, the biggest problem you're going to have is trying to get a spare server from your managed service provider to reinstall your best practice database, and you're going to have all this downtime. Datto is a server, and in the event of a failure, it spins up and becomes your server. So you have a spare server on the rack ready to go. That device costs about $1,500, I think, in terms of investment. If you want to, you can activate Datto Cloud. So if your whole practice burns down tonight and you lose both your original server and your backup server, they will spin up your system in the cloud, and you can all keep practicing as of 9 a.m. the next morning, whether you've got a server or not. And that whole thing, the hardware's $1,500 roughly. Don't quote me on that. I'm not a Datto salesperson, and it will depend on your circumstances. And then there's a monthly subscription, which the last practice I did was, I think it was about $200 a month or something, to get a service like that. And it's just fabulous. I love it. So in the short term, those are probably the things I would look at and the types of investments that you can make. And in the wild, what we're seeing is just insufficient training, not enough cyber spend. And I know that none of us have money, but I can assure you, you really don't want to have money. With good internet, is Dropbox just as good? Yeah, so Dropbox is a similar system. The thing about Dropbox is, firstly, you don't know if, or it's highly likely that the data is not in Australia, which is manageable, but just a risk that you have to consider. The other thing is that your data absolutely is protected in the cloud, but Dropbox cannot be your server. So your data will be protected, but you're in that same bucket where something, you've had a fire, say, and then you've got to ring up your IT company and say, hey, we need like another server. And they'll say, oh, we only have one spare and it's out with another client at the moment. And you go, okay, well, we've got this backup, but what do we put the backup on? And that's the issue. Whereas with Datto, you put the Datto is your server. Either in the cloud, it's the server in the cloud as well. So it is a bit more advanced than Dropbox in that respect. It's also in Australia. I will park the question about online cybersecurity education. There probably is, I don't have any ready to go, but I'll follow that one up after the session. We are pretty much out of time. So in the medium term, long story short is I'd like you to start mapping your information flows. And we've given you a lot of information about this in the resources. So that is where information is coming in and out of your practice and everywhere it's stored. And then I want you to start scrutinizing your suppliers. Cubico is fabulous, by the way. That's why I use them as an example. But I'm pretty sick and tired of practices suffering the consequences when software providers haven't done their due diligence and frankly are not keeping up with the times. And then the medical practice pays the price. So I'm starting to recommend that all practices basically form an IT committee, have their managed service provider and software providers audited. And I've given some examples on the screen now. Again, I have no affiliation with these guys. I've worked with them, so that's why they're on the slide, and I know they're not terrible, which is why I have a lot of respect for all three of these companies, but there's no commercial arrangement there, just some ideas to get you started. You can Google your own if you would like. And I think that getting your stuff audited externally is starting to become a really good idea. Some of them even do it for free or for a very low cost. I know DMS is pretty good at financially in the industry, helping out practices for that sort of thing. And finally, all the lessons we've learned today, I've put in a register for you to be downloaded, and I'm about to be kicked off the stage because of time. And there are other approaches where you don't need to have a password, which please call me about. I think you should be moving to zero trust. So please ask your managed service provider about zero trust. Where you don't have a castle, you have a hotel, because it locks all the doors inside, unlike in a castle. I've got a steering committee model here for you to have a look at, as well as some diagrams about how the single sign-on and passwordless experience could work. And there is, in the downloads, a whole bunch of questions for you to ask your MSP and a huge amount of resources on that website for you to take away with you. I'm not a lawyer and accountant. There's a disclaimer. And that brings us to the end of the session with 2 minutes to spare. I do apologize, the question time did get a bit eroded. But you can contact me anytime via email or phone if you have any other questions. And I tried to answer them as I went. So I hope you had a nice experience, and thanks for spending time with me this evening.
Thank you so much, Darcy. What an insightful session. And I'm sure many of us will be walking away tonight taking some actions tomorrow. So thank you for all that information. Just a reminder for those online, please remember the special microsite that Darcy has shared with us tonight. Obviously, we will send out to all attendees a copy of this presentation and a link to that site so that you can actually go into that and actually find those valuable resources that Darcy has referred to throughout the evening. Also, just a reminder that for those, when you're logging off this evening, if you please take a moment to complete the survey, we'd greatly appreciate that. So on behalf of my colleagues, and thank you again, Darcy, for this evening's session, I'd like to wish you all a good night, and we look forward to seeing you all next time. Thank you, everybody, and good night.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.